This week, we're joined by Jemma Baker, Deputy Director of Future Retail Policy at Ofgem. We talk about what good communication looks like in regulated sectors, how to support customers during uncertainty, and where organisations can raise the bar in the year ahead. Hi, Jemma.
Hi, Sam. How are you?
Very good. Thank you so much for joining us on this rainy English day. So can we get started by explaining what your role is at Ofgem and what is future retail policy and how does it connect to communication?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. So, for those of you might not come across Ofgem, Ofgem stands for the Office of Gas and Electricity Markets, so with a regulator for Great Britain. And effectively, it's our job to protect the interests of current, future customers. And if you're wondering, I guess, what I do, so my role specifically is I look after retail policy. So I'm responsible for setting the rules for the energy suppliers. And one of the areas that I focus on is good customer services. So that includes all customers, businesses as well. And effective communication is critical to good customer service. So that's why I'm talking to you today, I think.
So there are two things that spring to my mind in that. There's always been this push and pull between regulation and good customer experience, good customer communications. There's the how can we make sure that regulation doesn't get in the way of connecting with humans? And there's also the part that's how do we communicate regulation to people and to businesses? So I imagine you deal with both. Are there sort of core principles that underpin what you define as good customer communications around regulation?
I think for us, it's probably 4 key ones. One is that language is basic and there's no industry jargon in there. And, energy in itself is inherently complex. You have things like kilowatt hours, unit rates, calorific value, to mention just a few. And I've been in energy for about 20 years now, and I've picked up quite a lot of jargon. But for a customer, it's really important that language that's used is plain English. I think my other ones would be compassionate tone needs to underpin the communications. We deal with customers that might be in different situations, whether they're financially vulnerable, whether they have mental health issues that they're struggling with. And it's really important that those communications are compassionate, that there's a range of communications available. So like not everybody wants to call their supplier. Sometimes they want email communications, chat functions. And then I guess finally that those communications are personalised. So as much as possible, there's obviously a place for generic communication, but as much as possible, they're tailored to that individual customer to tailor their support for that customer in their own circumstances. So I think those principles are probably what underpin all of our guidance, the rules that we put in, and they're tailored towards driving those, I guess, core features.
I imagine those are principles that underpin how most businesses and most organizations, big and small, want to communicate with their customers. That, there's generally, we all have good intentions to do that. Where do you see organizations tripping up and getting it wrong despite those intentions?
I think in energy sector, the biggest tension is on billing. So I mentioned earlier that energy is inherently complex. And I think that really comes to a head when a customer has a bill. And I think when you look at our complaints, so the Energy Ombudsman complaints in 2024, 58% of those were on billing. Now, billing is a huge category that could cover like a multitude of sins in there. So that, it can cover things like metering issues or affordability. So it's not just about the communication on that bill. But having said that, that's a large number of customers that are struggling. And I think bills can be quite complex because they contain very specialist terms. They're not always very consumer friendly, but it's really important that a customer understands that bill because they need to know how much energy have they used? How has that been calculated? What does that then mean for the cost that they're going to incur? So it's really important that they understand it. But to get there's some quite complicated calculations that need to be done. And I think when we then also look at things like energy literacy, when we looked at some research, it said that those between 18 and 24, only 10% of them reported understanding their bill. So 90% of that cohort didn't understand their energy bill, which is huge. Now, I'm not saying that all suppliers are performing poorly because they're really not. And there's some fantastic innovation out there on billing, and we've seen improvements across the board on customer satisfaction in recent years. So, and that includes for billing accuracy, billing understanding. But I think in that area in general, it's probably the hardest area to get right because of you need to have a certain level of energy literacy and understanding.
And there's probably quite a range in that energy literacy as well. Obviously, you've got the average, but at both ends of the spectrum, you've got people who have owned their own home for years and been dealing with these things for years, maybe for their family. And then you've got, like you say, young people who might have just bought their own home. You've got people who are struggling as well, who might face financial, cognitive, or digital barriers to that understanding. So how do you make sure that everybody is supported when you're designing communications like these?
Absolutely. I think that comes back to some of these key principles of using plain language, not using industry jargon, personalising the communication so that it's actually relevant to that individual customer and their circumstances, a range of communication. So when you think about a customer that might be in debt, for example, or struggling to pay their energy bill, taking that first step to admit that they've got a problem and to seek help is one of the hardest things to do, to reach out for help. And sometimes calling someone up on the phone is difficult and it's too hard a step to take. But actually, if you offer other services like an SMS function, a chat function, an app function, it gives the customer more choice over how they communicate, which can be really important. But beyond that, collaboration is really, really key. So there are some fabulous like specialist organizations out there that focus on supporting those customers. So things like, for example, you have Plain Numbers who focus on numerical literacy. So they can partner with energy suppliers and help them communicate their energy bills to customers that might have low numerical literacy. We've got groups like the WISE group who look at lived in experiences. So they focus on customers that are in communities that might have issues with mental health, unemployment, fuel poverty, and they can help the supplier tailor and reach those customer groups, tailor their communications, reach them, test them with customers with lived-in experiences. So I think for me, it's remembering those principles, but also collaboration is with specialist organisations is critical.
Yeah, we had Ben from Plain Numbers on the podcast quite a few episodes ago, but I'll have to look into the WISE group because I don't think I've heard of them. So when we talk about digital channels, you mentioned chatbots, and these things have evolved now to a point where there was a real division between that in-person or analog phone-based communication and digital communication. Digital, say 10 years ago was very step-based, quite simple. And now we're seeing a bit of a blend where it's much easier to hand people off to one or the other. And those experiences seem to be getting a lot better. Just as, from my experience as a customer, what role do you see digital channels playing in that sort of hybrid world of communications in making sure that sensitive information is protected when it's delivered?
So you're right, there's been huge developments on the digital communication side, and they're already being used for handling sensitive information. So customers' consumption, their billing information, it's all on apps now, which means accessibility is great. So there's definitely been a lot of improvement in accessibility of that information that's needed to a customer. But a customer also needs to feel confident that the information that they're getting in there is protected, it's trusted. I think one of the key things for that is it's consistent information. So no matter where the customer's getting that information, whether it's their printed out bill, whether it's an email, whether it's on the phone, the supplier themselves, there needs to be a level of consistency in that information so that the customer can trust it, but also that the supplier respects the customer's preferences so that they are, if the customer's asked for a digital communication route, the supplier respects that communication route and they understand what those individual customer needs are. But, not all customers are, I guess, digitally savvy or have access to internet. I think it's like 7% of households don't have internet access at home.
Yeah, and digital literacy or illiteracy is higher than that.
Those traditional communication channels are also really important to build trust with that customer that their data is being used appropriately and they have. So bills, annual statements is also really important. Having that ability to check with that supplier by calling them up, to talk to somebody if they need to, I think is really important when you also have the digital channels so that a customer has a second point of reference so they can cross-check the data that they're receiving.
Yeah, but I imagine a lot of the reduction of those support calls comes now from a much better understanding of how to explain things like kilowatt hours, confusing things in utilities that people might not, we don't use these things in our everyday lives. We talked to Ben actually at Plain Numbers about this, more with regard to financial literacy. And, we talked about APR as one of those things that is very difficult to explain, but there's a lot more research on the psychology behind how you get people to understand it. I wonder if there's specific things within utilities, billing statements, policies that you do or people can do now, organizations can do to make messages more meaningful, more understandable with regard to those sort of common terms and concepts.
I think it's definitely an area for improvement, I think, for us in terms of energy literacy. So what I think it's fundamental for a customer. You think about what's happening in the energy sector. There's now solar, heat pumps, there's all this decarbonisation tech, and all of that requires more decisions for a customer. There's more complexity in there. It's when do I put my washing machine on to get the lowest price? Do I replace my boiler with a heat pump? Should I do I have the finance available to put in solar? All these complex decisions that a consumer needs to make. And at the moment, some customers are struggling with, I guess, the more fundamentals of how much energy have I used and how much have I paid. So I think there's definitely a journey to go on for us on that energy literacy. And if you want customers to adopt these new technologies, they need to have confidence and trust in the companies, but also their communication. Their data is protected with all of that. So I think there's definitely a journey for us to go on. And I think one of the reasons at the moment we're looking at our rules around billing and have we focused them in the right place. And one of the reasons we're looking at moving potentially more to outcomes-based regulation is, can we focus on the end outcome rather than the process to get there, which gives firms more space to innovate rather than us setting out the regulation for that process. I think it's one of the reasons we're looking at that now.
And you must work very closely with organizations in a sort of sandbox style. Do you, when you look at rolling out regulatory changes, new regulations, so that you can test and collaborate with industry before that happens? Is that how it works?
We do have a sandbox function. Suppliers can come to us sometimes as well with an idea. It doesn't have to be us driven. Suppliers can come to us and say, we've got this idea and your rules are getting in the way. Is there a safe way that we can test this? And we'll have a conversation with them about that and if that's possible. So we do use sandbox functions. We also, which is what we're looking at the moment, is do we roll out change regulation to one area specifically, like might be billing or maybe it's complaints or might be another area, and do an evaluation from that, see how it works, and then apply that evaluation to our next areas. We do work that way, and that's one of the things we're looking at the moment, particularly when we're considering some potentially fundamental shifts to using more outcomes-based regulation.
When you were talking about heat pumps and solar and how customers make these decisions as to what's best for them, obviously vendors will tell you, heat pump vendors will tell you heat pumps are best for you, and that they'll have ways of informing clients on their own websites, in their own media. You obviously play a part in how that communication rolls out regarding comparing products and services across providers. So how are you making sure that customers are empowered to make the right decisions through regulation?
We've actually got a new role. So we've been given, or will soon be given, the role to regulate what we call third-party intermediaries. These are things like your price comparison websites, or in the business sector, it's more energy brokers is more common. They can be really valuable to a customer because when you have these more complex choices, they can help a customer navigate through them to look at where they've got lots of variables, lots of different options. They can really be helpful to a customer to navigate some of those decisions. But it's not always not all of those firms are always transparent. So we put in a rule recently around third-party intermediary commissions, which means that they need to tell a customer if you have purchased a product through a third-party intermediary, then the supplier needs to be clear how much commission that the supplier has got with that third party. So I think part of this is making sure that it's transparent for a customer. And I think that helps build trust. It's not the fact that they've got a commission, it's just that the customer can understand how much of the bill that they're paying goes towards that third party intermediary. So we've done some steps towards it, but I think we will be looking more closely at the third party firms.
That's obviously a big part of the future of retail and your job. You know, these comparison sites are very, very useful as customers, but quite highly regulated and quite butting up against regulation, whether it's in, you know, financial services, where we've seen probably slightly earlier than utilities, we saw them come out. Now I think there's that ability to be able to look at what's been done in financial services for you guys and say, oh, they're doing this, maybe we could do this too. Do you look at other regulators like that?
We look at them a lot. So we look at cross-sector comparisons quite a lot. So particularly when you think about the example of us being given new powers to regulate third-party intermediaries, at the moment in the supply sector anyway, that we regulate a handful of companies, whereas if you think about third-party intermediaries, there's thousands of them. So I think we're not sure exactly how many, but at the moment I think there's at least 3,000 third-party intermediaries, depending on how you define them. That would require a very different style of regulation than the style of regulation that we have now. And when we look at other organisations like the FCA, who already regulate large, like, numbers of firms and the different styles of regulation that they use to do that. So, and we'll definitely be looking to them as they already have powers to regulate those third-party intermediaries. And so we'll 100% be learning from the FCA.
And I guess other countries you probably look at as well. There's lots of examples of how regulation is rolled out differently in other countries. I assume that's quite interesting to you.
Yeah, 100%. I actually worked in Australia for a couple of years at the Australian Energy Regulator, and I've kept a few of my contacts and networks from there. So we have regular catch-ups with them because quite often different countries are facing similar challenges. They're facing similar decarbonisation challenges. They're facing similar issues with energy literacy, for example. And it's really helpful to us to understand how they are also navigating them. And I think, for example, at the moment in Australia, they're also looking at regulatory complexity and how can you simplify it, which is something that we're also interested in at the moment. So we learn from other countries as well.
Bar the fact that they don't have to put the heating on as much.
They have air conditioning though, which is
Well, yeah, no, you're right. I think I prefer that today though. I wonder how, if you can talk about this, if you've seen any particular sort of communication styles or approaches, maybe perhaps without naming names, that impressed you in terms of clarity, accessibility, customer support, the things that we've been talking about that kind of take the regulation and go a little bit further than it, rather than seeing it as, you know, box ticking exercise. They really use it to empower them to do something different.
I think the use of technology has really changed over the last few years, and we've seen some firms really embracing it where, you know, years ago it would be that the bill is the only form of communication, or the annual statement, or if your fixed term contract's coming to an end, you'll get a letter and it will tell you what your options are. But we're now seeing firms really experiment with apps. So they're experimenting with interactive graphs that are linked to your smart meter and showing in more like not full real time, but almost real time of customers' energy consumption. What does that mean for their bill? They're experimenting with different emails to tell a customer what it means when they get a bill. What does that mean for them? We're seeing them use AI as well, where they're looking at using AI to help their frontline staff have more effective personalised information for that individual customer, so that when a customer calls up, the frontline staff member has more answers at their fingertips that are personalised to that customer. We're also seeing them use AI to help with energy literacy. When you have customers not understanding certain concepts of energy, they're using more digital functions to help develop that. So some of those developments are really exciting, and you can see it pushing through to actual results. So we've seen, for example, in 2022, customer satisfaction was at its all-time low, so around like 66%. We're now at all-time highs of 82% over that time period. So you can see industry making a real sea change, and that's across the board. It's for understanding, it's complaints, it's also for customers in vulnerable situations where they've gone from satisfaction of around the 50s up to the 70s. So it's across all groups. So there's been a real improvement, and I do think the technology developments are part of that answer.
That's amazing. And how amazing for you to be able to see as an organization, as a team, the impact that those changes are making in coordination with industry and technology. You mentioned AI there, and we can't not talk about AI these days. Is that central to upcoming changes, focus within Ofgem's 2026? What are you thinking about within that space?
We are looking at AI. We're interested in understanding more about how suppliers are using it. What does this mean for their customers? So it's a big focus for us to understand how suppliers are innovating, but also making sure that our regulations don't get in the way, but ultimately still protect consumers. So we're very interested in it. We're looking at and we've seen some very encouraging signs. I think it's fair to say there's still a way to go. So understanding how that impacts customers in more vulnerable situations, in financial difficulty. I think there's probably some more work to be done to understand how AI can help, but we're very interested in it. We want to make sure that our regulations support innovation.
Yeah, and like you say, that even those internal but customer-facing tools that allow you to, because we all have so much data about customers these days, summarize what we've got so that we can be able to engage with customers on the right foot, with the right information, is massively empowering to, customer service and stuff. What advice would you give to wrap up organizations looking to strengthen their communications practices in the year ahead?
I think for me, it's just centering on what a customer's individual needs are and having that baked into all the systems, the processes. Customers' needs can be really diverse. They are consistently evolving and changing, and it's really important that the firms listen and respond and refine their practices accordingly. And I think we've definitely seen some very encouraging signs. And I think we want to adapt how we regulate to facilitate that as well, which is why we're thinking about outcomes-based regulation and how that can support that.
It sounds very abstract when you say, oh, I'm in regulation. But if I think back to so I had a period of maybe 10 years when I wasn't paying electricity utility bills because I was abroad and then I was renting. And before I remember that it was wildly different to how I deal with at least my energy company now. And I love my app. For me to be able to, for a customer to be able to say, oh, I love my app, it's quite a big thing to be able to say about what's essentially something that you have to have, that you need. And it is that digital engagement that I get with my supplier that means I'm more informed and I understand what's going on, that makes me say that. So whatever you're doing, it seems like the industry's heading in the right direction.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the customer satisfaction rates that we're seeing is fabulous. And I think what we want to do is to make sure that we can maintain that momentum as the sector changes and as these new technologies are coming in, that we can keep that trajectory going. And I think you mentioned sort of outcomes regulation being a bit abstract. I guess one way to help define example is where we put in some rules, I think 2023, which were around ensuring suppliers are easy to contact. So that's the outcome we want. We want them to be easily contactable. What we don't set out is how they get there. So we're not saying you have to have call wait times of X and Y, or you have to have this digital channel, and you have to have this telephone service. We want them focused on being easy to contact, and how they get there and is up to them.
Being goal-oriented rather than focused on ticking a list of numbers, essentially.
Exactly.
I think we have to let you go now. But before we do, I'll ask you one last question to wrap up. What excites you in 2026, either personally or professionally? What are you most excited about this year?
Personally, keep my boat afloat. I actually live I live on the water.
On the Thames?
At the moment, I'm on the Grand.
Oh, you said you're in the Peak District, yeah.
Yeah, but so I move around. So the boat floats and it moves.
That's the beauty of having a boat, I guess, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I'm excited for my boat journeys. Professional
Canal boat, is it?
canal boat, yeah, I have. I'm
Very cool.
so I also, for the energy geeks that might be listening to your podcast, I'm also self-sufficient. So I have my own solar battery system. So I'm fully off grid. So, have some
That's
idea of
amazing.
managing my energy consumption.
I think we might have to do another podcast about that. How long has that been then? Is that a relatively new thing? Or?
I've been on board for about 5 years now, so I'm not quite an old hat. You see people that have lived on the boat, like my mother-in-law's lived on the boats for 20 years, so I'm nowhere near her standard.
It's the sailor's life for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for taking some time to chat to me today. It's been really interesting. I'm sure we'll follow up with you at some point soon. But for now, Jemma, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.